The massive space station hung in the darkness between three different star systems, and it was the most beautiful thing HFY War had ever seen in his 23 years of life. He pressed his four hands against the viewport of the transport shuttle, his silver eyes wide with wonder as the Galactic Academy of Interstellar Sciences grew larger and larger before him. It was a city floating in space, home to scholars and scientists from over 3,000 different species, and today it would become his home too. HFY was a Selvari, tall and thin with blue-gray skin and 4 arms that his people used for their famous multitasking abilities. His kind were known throughout the galaxy as great thinkers and researchers, and he had worked his entire young life to earn a place at this legendary institution. The shuttle docked with a gentle thump, and HFY gathered his belongings with trembling excitement. He was here to study xenobiology, the science of alien life forms, and he could not wait to begin. The corridors of the academy were filled with creatures of every shape and size imaginable. HFY walked past towering Moldrith made of living crystal, tiny phoenix that floated through the air on wings of light, and massive Krethver whose insectoid bodies clicked and clattered as they moved. It was overwhelming and wonderful all at once. His assigned mentor was waiting for him in the xenobiology wing, and Professor Yevhen was exactly what he had expected. She was an ancient Selvari female. Her blue skin faded to pale silver with age, and her 4 arms moved with the slow grace of someone who had seen many centuries pass. "Welcome, young HFY," she said in her native language, and her voice was warm, but her eyes were sharp and knowing. "I have read your research proposals, and I am impressed by your ambition." HFY felt pride swell in his chest. "Thank you, Professor. I wish to understand what makes certain species more dangerous than others. I want to study the biology of apex predators across the galaxy." Professor Yevhen's expression changed for just a moment, something flickering in her ancient eyes that HFY could not identify. "A worthy field of study," she said slowly, "and I believe I have just the resource to begin your education." She led him through a series of secured corridors, each one requiring higher and higher clearance codes, until they reached a small research room with a single holographic terminal in the center. The walls were bare metal, and the room felt cold and serious. "This," Professor Yevhen said, gesturing to the terminal, "is access to the Species Threat Assessment Database. It is one of the Academy's most classified resources, and very few first-year students ever see it." HFY's heart beat faster in his chest. He had heard rumors of this database, whispers among older students about a secret ranking system that measured the danger level of every known sentient species in the galaxy. "The database ranks all spacefaring civilizations based on their potential as apex predators," the professor continued. "It considers biology, psychology, history, and capability. It is the most comprehensive threat analysis ever created." She activated the terminal with a wave of her hand, and a long list of species names appeared in glowing blue text. "You may use this for your research, but I warn you, young one, some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten." With those strange words, she left him alone in the cold room. HFY sat down at the terminal, his 4 hands hovering over the controls with eager anticipation. This was exactly what he needed for his research, a complete ranking of the galaxy's most dangerous species. He began scrolling through the list, starting from the bottom where the least threatening species were ranked. There were the Phoenix, gentle creatures of light, and the Plorbian, peaceful traders who had never known war. These made sense to him. As he scrolled higher, the names became more familiar and more frightening. The Moldrith were ranked in the middle, their crystal bodies nearly indestructible, but their minds slow and peaceful. The Vornek were higher, their psychic abilities making them feared across 3 sectors. Near the top, he found the Krethver, and this made perfect sense to him. The massive insectoid warriors had conquered dozens of systems before the Galactic Council forced them into treaties. Their natural armor, their acid blood, their hive mind coordination made them terrifying. But the Krethver were not ranked first. Kethril frowned and scrolled higher, expecting to see some species he had learned about in his studies. Perhaps the legendary void hunters who lived in the spaces between stars, or the mysterious architects who had vanished millions of years ago. Instead, he saw a name he had never heard before. At the very top of the list, glowing in red warning text that he had not seen used for any other species, was a single entry: Human Soul System, Classification. Omega Apex Thral stared at the screen, certain that he must be misunderstanding something. He had never heard of this species, not once in all his years of study. How could a species unknown to him be ranked above the mighty Krethvor? He tapped the entry with a trembling finger, and a holographic image appeared before him. The creature displayed was small, smaller than a Selvari, with only 2 arms and 2 legs. Its skin was a soft pinkish-brown color, and it had no claws, no armor plates, no visible weapons of any kind. It looked fragile and weak, like something that should be prey rather than predator. This must be a mistake, Kethril whispered to himself. There is no way this soft little creature is the most dangerous species in the galaxy. He checked the classification again, hoping to find an error, but the red text remained unchanged. Omega APEX. He had never seen that classification before. Most dangerous species were ranked as alpha or beta threats. What did Omega mean? His fingers moved to open the full species file, but he hesitated. Professor Yevon's warning echoed in his mind about knowledge that could not be forgotten. But he was a scientist, and his curiosity was stronger than his caution. He opened the file, and as the information began to scroll across the screen, Kethril felt something he had never experienced in all his years of academic study. He felt the cold touch of genuine fear creeping up his spine. The first line of the file read, "Warning, the following species is to be approached with extreme caution. Do not engage in hostile action under any circumstances. Report all contact to Galactic Council immediately." Kethril leaned closer to the screen, his silver eyes wide. What could possibly make this small, soft, clawless creature so terrifying that it warranted such a warning? He began to read, and his entire understanding of the universe started to crumble around him. Kethril sat in the cold research room for hours, reading and rereading the human file until his silver eyes ached, and his mind felt like it might break apart from the weight of impossible information. At first, he thought the database must contain errors. Surely some scientist had made mistakes when entering this data, because nothing he read made any logical sense. The file began with basic biology, and even this simple section made Kethril feel dizzy with disbelief. Humans were persistence predators, a hunting classification so rare that most xenobiologists believed it to be purely theoretical. These creatures could chase prey for days without stopping, walking and running across vast distances until their target simply collapsed from exhaustion. Most species in the galaxy could sprint for minutes at most, but humans could maintain pursuit for hours that stretched into days. Their home planet, called Earth, was classified as a Category 12 death world, and Kethril had to check this information 3 times because he could not believe it. Category 12 was the highest danger rating for any habitable planet, reserved for worlds. So hostile that colonization was considered impossible. Earth had extreme temperature variations that would kill most species within hours. It had a massive natural satellite that caused the oceans to rise and fall in violent tides. The planets. Sun bombarded the surface with deadly radiation. The atmosphere was filled with oxygen, a gas so corrosive that it caused most metals to rust and decay. And the gravity was crushing, far heavier than the galactic average. And humans had not just survived on this nightmare world. They had thrived and spread across every corner of it. The biology section continued with information that made Cathrall feel sick to his stomach. Humans had evolved to consume substances that were lethal toxins to nearly every other known species. They drank ethanol, a powerful poison that destroyed organic tissue, and they did this for recreation and pleasure. They ate capsaicin, a chemical weapon that plants had evolved specifically to prevent being eaten, and humans actively sought out foods containing higher and higher concentrations of it. They consumed caffeine and theobromine, both of which would stop the hearts of most galactic species within minutes. Cathrall pushed back from the terminal and tried to calm his racing thoughts. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke or test for new students. But the database was deadly serious. And there was more. The file described human physical resilience in terms that sounded more like science fiction than reality. Humans could lose massive amounts of blood and continue functioning. They could break their bones and survive. Their bodies actually rebuilding the damaged skeleton over time. They could lose entire limbs and not only survive, but adapt and continue their lives. Their immune systems were aggressive and adaptive, fighting off diseases and infections that would kill other species instantly. They carried bacteria in their mouths that could cause fatal infections in wounds. Even their tears and saliva contained antimicrobial compounds. And then Cathrall reached the section on human psychology, and everything he had read before seemed almost reasonable by comparison. Humans possessed something the file called pack bonding, and psychological traits so extreme that xenopsychologists had created an entirely new classification for it. Humans would form deep emotional attachments to almost anything, not just their own kind, but other species, machines, abstract concepts, and even inanimate objects. This might have seemed harmless or even foolish, but the file explained why it was terrifying. When something a human had bonded with was threatened, the human would fight to protect it with absolutely no regard for their own survival. They would walk into certain death, face overwhelming odds, sacrifice everything they had, all to protect something they loved. The file contained a quote from a human philosopher that made Cathrall's blood run cold. "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down their life for their friends." Humans did not just feel this way about other humans. They formed these bonds with alien species, with pets, with robots and machines, with ideas and beliefs. They were capable of unlimited violence in defense of things they cared about. Cathrall stood up from the terminal, his forelegs shaking beneath him. He needed to speak with Professor Yevhen. He needed someone to explain how any of this could be true. He found her in her office, surrounded by ancient texts and glowing holographic displays, and when she saw his pale face, she nodded slowly as if she had been expecting him. "You have read the human file," she said, and it was not a question. "It cannot be real," Cathrall replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Those species can have all of these traits and still exist. Evolution would not allow it." Professor Yevhen gestured for him to sit, and her ancient eyes held a sadness that he had never seen before. "I remember when we first made contact with humanity," she said slowly. "I was young then, younger than you are now. We thought they were harmless, these soft little creatures from an unremarkable star system." She paused, and the silence in the room felt heavy. "We were wrong," she continued. "We were so very wrong. Everything in that file is true, and there is much more that is not included because it is too dangerous to record." Cathrall felt his hope crumbling. But how do we coexist with such creatures? How has the galaxy survived contact with them? The professor leaned forward, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because of one simple fact that saves us all. Humans are not just capable of extreme violence. They are also capable of extreme kindness, extreme empathy, extreme love. They contain both the monster and the saint. And most of the time, they choose to be the saint. She stood and walked to her window, looking out at the stars. The Galactic Council created special protocols for dealing with humanity. We do not threaten them, we do not corner them, we do not give them reasons to see us as enemies. We treat them with respect and friendship. And in return, they have become valuable members of our community. Kethril absorbed this information slowly. You said first contact protocols are different for humans. What does that mean? Professor Yevhen turned back to him and a small smile crossed her aged face. It means that instead of studying them from a distance, we invite them in. There is a human here at the Academy right now, and attached to the Earth Ambassador. Kethril felt fear grip his hearts. A human is here, on this station? Her name is Commander Elise Vance, the professor said. She has been here for 2 years. And in all that time, she has never harmed anyone. She is polite, intelligent, and genuinely friendly. She looked at Kethril with those knowing ancient eyes. Would you like to meet her? Every instinct in Kethril's body screamed at him to refuse, to run back to his home world and forget everything he had learned. But he was a scientist, and his curiosity was stronger than his fear. Yes, he said, though his voice trembled. I want to understand. Professor Yevhen nodded with what might have been approval. Then I will arrange a meeting. But remember, young one, she will be studying you just as carefully as you study her. Humans are very good at reading other species. Kethril left her office with his mind spinning and his heart racing. Tomorrow he would meet a real human, and he had no idea what to expect. The diplomatic quarter of the Academy was decorated with flags and symbols from thousands of different civilizations. And Kethril walked through it with all 4 of his arms pressed tightly against his body in a gesture of nervous anxiety. He had not slept at all the previous night. His mind filled with images of persistent predators chasing their prey across endless landscapes, of creatures drinking poison for pleasure, of soft-skinned beings fighting with no regard for their own survival. Professor Yevhen had arranged the meeting in a zero-gravity observation lounge, a beautiful room with transparent walls that offered a stunning view of a nearby nebula. She had explained that humans found such views calming, and Kethril appreciated any factor that might keep the apex predator relaxed. He arrived early and chose a seat near the exit, checking 3 times to make sure the door mechanism was working properly. If something went wrong, he wanted to be able to escape quickly. Other students and faculty members passed by the lounge entrance, and Kethril noticed something strange about their behavior. They would glance inside, see that the room was reserved for the meeting, and then move away with unusual speed. Word had spread that the human would be here, and everyone was avoiding the area. Then she arrived. Commander Elise Vance was smaller than Kethril had expected, standing only about 2/3 of his height, with brown hair cut short and eyes that were a startling shade of green. She wore a simple gray uniform with no visible weapons or armor, and she moved through the corridor with an easy, relaxed stride. But as she walked, Kethril noticed that other species parted before her like water flowing around a stone. No one bumped into her, no one walked too close, no one even made eye contact. They simply moved aside and pretended she was not there. The human did not seem to notice, or perhaps she was simply used to it. She entered the observation lounge with a friendly smile, and Kethril forced himself to remain seated even though every instinct told him to flee. "You must be Kethril," she said, and her voice was pleasant and warm. "Professor Yevhen told me about your research project. I think it sounds fascinating." She extended one of her hands toward him, and Kethril stared at it in confusion for a moment before remembering that humans use this gesture as a greeting. He carefully reached out with one of his own hands and allowed her to grasp it briefly. Her grip was firm but not painful, and her skin was surprisingly warm. He could feel the strength in her fingers, hidden beneath that soft exterior. "Thank you for meeting with me," Cathrall managed to say, and he was proud that his voice only trembled a little. "I hope I am not interrupting your important work." The human laughed, and the sound was strange and musical. "Not at all. I mostly attend meetings and write reports. Meeting a curious young scientist is much more interesting." She settled into a seat across from him, and Cathrall began to observe her with the careful attention of a trained xenobiologist. At first glance, nothing about her seemed dangerous. She sat in a relaxed posture. Her expression was open and friendly, and she made easy conversation about the academy and his studies. She seemed like the least threatening creature in the galaxy. But as the minutes passed, Cathrall began to notice the small details that the file had warned him about. Her eyes never stayed still. Even while she was talking and smiling, those green eyes constantly moved, tracking every motion in her peripheral vision. When a maintenance drone floated past the window, she noted it. When a distant door opened and closed, she registered it. She was aware of everything around her at all times, even while appearing completely relaxed. She had chosen her seat with care, positioning herself so that her back was to a solid wall with a clear view of both the entrance and the viewport. Cathrall realized that he had instinctively done the same thing, but for her it seemed like second nature. At one point, a loud bang echoed through the station, probably a piece of equipment malfunctioning somewhere in the maintenance level. Cathrall jumped in his seat, his heart racing. The human did not flinch at all. Her only reaction was a slight movement of her hand toward her hip, where a weapon might have been carried. The gesture was so fast and so smooth that it was over before Cathrall fully registered it had happened. She noticed him staring and smiled apologetically. "Sorry about that. Old habits are hard to break." "You were a soldier," Cathrall said, and it was not a question. "I still am, technically," she replied. "Marines, 20 years of service before I transferred to the diplomatic corps. I have seen my share of difficult situations." Cathrall gathered his courage and decided to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "Commander Vance, I have read the Academy's file on your species. I have seen your ranking on the threat assessment database." Her expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes, a kind of ancient awareness that made Cathrall suddenly feel like a small creature being watched by something much larger. "Ah," she said calmly, "you have seen the list. I wondered how long it would take for that to come up." "I do not understand it," Cathrall admitted. "Your species has no natural weapons, no armor, no venom. You are physically weaker than most sentient species. How can you be ranked as the most dangerous?" The human was quiet for a moment, looking out at the nebula with an expression that Cathrall could not read. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Tell me, Cathrall, what do you think makes a species dangerous?" He considered the question carefully. Strength, weapons, speed, aggression, the ability to kill efficiently. She nodded slowly. "Those things matter, yes. But there are plenty of species with natural weapons and armor who are ranked far below us. The Krethver have acid blood and can tear through metal with their claws, but they are not ranked first." "Then what is it?" Cathrall asked. "What makes humans different?" Commander Vance turned back to face him, and her smile faded into something more serious. "We are not ranked first because of what we can do. We are ranked first because of what we have done." She paused, and the silence hung heavy in the air. "Humans have been making war on each other for as long as our species has existed," she continued. "We have invented weapons that can destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. We have created poisons that can kill millions. We have developed diseases in laboratories for the sole purpose of killing our enemies. Cathrall felt his blood running cold. "And here is the part that truly frightens the other species," she said, leaning slightly closer. "We have used these weapons. Not against aliens, not against monsters, but against each other. We have dropped nuclear bombs on our own cities. We have used chemical weapons on our own people. We have committed horrors that I cannot describe to you without making you sick." Her green eyes held his silver ones, and he could not look away. "We are the only species in the known galaxy that has ever used weapons of mass destruction on our own kind, and then built more of them." Cathrall wanted to speak, but no words would come. "The galaxy is not afraid of our claws, because we have none," Commander Vance said quietly. "They are afraid of our creativity, our determination, and our capacity for violence. They are afraid because they have studied our history, and they know what we are capable of." She leaned back in her chair, and the tension in the room seemed to ease slightly. "But I want you to understand something important," she added. "That same creativity and determination that makes us dangerous also makes us compassionate. We are capable of great evil, yes, but we are also capable of great good. The same species that invented nuclear weapons also invented medicine that saves billions of lives." Cathrall finally found his voice. "How do you live with that? How do you carry that knowledge inside you?" The human smiled, and there was something sad in her expression. "We remember. We teach our children about the horrors of our past so that they understand why we must never repeat them. We are dangerous because we know exactly what we are, and we choose, every single day, to be better." She stood and extended her hand again. "Thank you for meeting with me, Cathrall. I hope I have not frightened you too badly." He took her hand, and this time his grip was steadier. "You have given me much to think about." As she left the lounge, Cathrall sat alone with the stars, trying to understand the strange and terrifying creatures called humans. They were monsters who had chosen to be kind, wolves who had learned to love their neighbors. And somehow, that made them more frightening than any natural predator he had ever studied. 3 weeks after his meeting with Commander Vance, Cathrall received a message from Professor Yevin, summoning him to a restricted section of the academy he had never visited before. The corridors leading to this area were guarded by security drones and required biometric scans at every checkpoint. By the time he reached the final door, he had passed through more security measures than he had encountered in his entire life combined. Professor Yevin was waiting for him inside, a small briefing room with walls that absorbed light and made the space feel like a void. "I have been watching your research progress," she said. "You have shown maturity and restraint that is rare in one so young." "I have been trying to understand," Cathrall replied. "But every answer leads to more questions." The professor nodded slowly. "That is why I have decided to give you access to something that very few beings ever see. The complete historical archive on humanity. This goes far beyond the basic threat assessment file." She activated a holographic projector, and the room filled with images and data that seemed to glow with an inner light. "What you are about to see is classified at the highest level. It is not shared because it might damage diplomatic relations, and because it is simply too disturbing for most species to process." Cathrall steeled himself and nodded. "I am ready." The first images were of a beautiful blue and green planet, and Cathrall recognized it as Earth from the basic species file. It looked peaceful and welcoming from space, a gem floating in the darkness. Then the images changed. He saw human armies marching across vast battlefields, millions of individuals fighting and dying in conflicts that lasted for years. He saw cities burning, civilians fleeing, bodies piled in mass graves. He saw weapons that defied description, machines designed with no purpose but to end as many lives as possible. The archive showed him something called the First World War, and Cathrall learned that humans had invented chemical weapons that melted lungs and burned skin. That they had created trenches where soldiers lived in mud and death for years. That tens of millions had died in a conflict that achieved almost nothing. And then, barely 20 years later, they had done it all again, but worse. The Second World War was a nightmare of horrors that made Kethral want to look away. He saw concentration camps where humans had systematically murdered millions of their own kind. He saw firebombing raids that turned entire cities into infernos. He saw the ultimate horror, the weapon that changed everything. The archive showed him a mushroom cloud rising over a human city called Hiroshima, and the data scrolling beside it made his heart stop. A single bomb had killed over 100,000 humans in an instant, and the radiation had continued killing for years afterward. 3 days later, they had dropped another one. They used nuclear weapons on populated cities, Kethral whispered. On their own species. Yes, Professor Yevon said, and her voice was heavy with sorrow. And after seeing the destruction, after counting the dead, after understanding what they had created, they did not stop. They built more bombs, thousands of them, enough to destroy their entire planet many times over. The archive continued, showing decades of something called the Cold War, where two groups of humans had pointed these world-ending weapons at each other for nearly 50 years, coming close to annihilation again and again. Kethral saw images of missile silos, of submarines carrying enough firepower to end civilizations, of early warning systems designed to give humans mere minutes to decide whether to destroy themselves. How did they survive? He asked. How are they still here? The professor gestured to the next section of the archive. Because of this. The images changed, showing humans building instead of destroying. He saw them creating medicine that cured diseases, developing technology that fed billions, reaching out into space with robots and then with their own bodies. He saw them establishing international organizations dedicated to peace, signing treaties to limit weapons, working together to solve problems that affected their entire species. Humans are unique in the galaxy, Professor Yevon explained. They possess both extreme aggression and extreme empathy in equal measure. The same species that invented nuclear weapons also invented concepts like human rights and humanitarian aid. They can commit atrocities and feel genuine remorse. They can hate and love with equal intensity. The archive displayed a translated human text, and Kethral read it slowly. We are the wolves we feared in the dark, and we learned to fear ourselves. This self-awareness is what makes them so dangerous and so fascinating, the professor continued. They know exactly what they are capable of, and they struggle every day to be better. It is not natural for them. It is a constant choice. Kethral was beginning to understand. They are not dangerous because they are monsters. They are dangerous because they choose not to be monsters, but they could choose differently at any moment. Exactly, Professor Yevon said. The Galactic Council did extensive modeling when humans were first discovered. They ran simulations of what would happen if humanity ever united against a common enemy and turned their full capacity for violence outward. She pulled up the simulation results, and Kethral felt true terror for the first time in his life. The model showed human fleets spreading across the galaxy like a plague, adapting to every defense, learning from every defeat, never stopping, never surrendering. Their soldiers continued fighting with injuries that would kill any other species 3 times over. Their scientists developed new weapons in weeks that other civilizations would need centuries to create. Their industry produced war materials at a rate that defied logical analysis. In every simulation, the result was the same, the professor said quietly. If humanity ever decided that the galaxy was their enemy, nothing could stop them. They would conquer or destroy everything in their path, not because they are the strongest or the fastest, but because they never give up. Kethral could barely process what he was seeing. Has anyone ever attacked them? Has anyone ever tested these models? Professor Yevin was silent for a long moment. Yes, she finally said. Once, early in humanity's contact with the galaxy, the Krethver Dominion decided that humans were weak and would make excellent slaves. They raided a human colony on the edge of their space, killing hundreds and taking prisoners. She pulled up another file, and Kethral leaned forward. What happened? The Krethver Dominion no longer exists. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The humans did not just retaliate, the professor continued. They systematically dismantled the entire Dominion, world by world, fleet by fleet. They did not stop until every Krethver leader was dead or captured, and every military installation was destroyed. The war lasted 14 years, and by the end, the Krethver were begging for peace. Kethral stared at the data in disbelief. The Krethver were one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. They were, Professor Yevin agreed. And humans broke them completely, not because humans were stronger, but because humans refused to stop. They took casualties that would have forced any other species to surrender, and they kept fighting. They lost battles and came back with new tactics. They were pushed to the edge of defeat and responded with weapons that the Krethver had never imagined. She closed the archive and looked at Kethral with her ancient, knowing eyes. This is why the galaxy treats humanity with such care, she said. This is why first contact protocols are different. This is why there is a human at this academy, welcomed as a friend rather than studied as a threat. Kethral understood now. We are not trying to contain them. We are trying to keep them happy. We are trying to give them no reason to see us as enemies, the professor corrected. Because if they ever do, if we ever make them feel that they must fight for survival against the entire galaxy, then everything we have built will burn. Kethral sat in silence, processing everything he had learned. Humans were not apex predators because of their claws or their venom or their armor. They were apex predators because they carried the capacity for infinite violence inside them, and they chose every single day to keep that violence contained. And the galaxy was wise enough to never give them a reason to let it out. 1 full year had passed since Kethral first scrolled through the species threat assessment database and discovered the impossible truth about humanity. He was a different person now. No longer the naive young student who had arrived at the academy with simple dreams of studying apex predators. He had seen too much, learned too much, and his understanding of the galaxy had been transformed completely. But he had also gained something unexpected, a friend. Commander Elise Vance had become a regular presence in his life, and over the months they had developed a genuine connection that surprised them both. She taught him a human game called chess, a strategic simulation of warfare that humans use to train their minds, and he discovered that playing against her was both terrifying and exhilarating. "You are getting better," she said one evening as they sat in the observation lounge, the chessboard floating between them in the zero gravity. "Another few years, and you might actually beat me." Kethral moved one of his pieces with careful consideration. "I am beginning to understand how humans think. You are always planning several moves ahead, always preparing for dangers that have not appeared yet." Elise smiled and captured his piece with a move he had not anticipated. "That is how we survived on Earth. The creatures that did not plan ahead got eaten by the ones that did." Their friendly competition was interrupted by an emergency alert that blared through the station, and Kethral watched as Elise's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The relaxed, friendly woman disappeared, replaced by something harder and more focused. "What is happening?" Kethral asked, his heart racing. Elise was already pulling up information on her personal communicator. "There has been an incident. A human trade convoy was blockaded by Vornik hegemony ships. They have taken hostages. The Vornak were powerful psychic predators who controlled a significant portion of the Eastern Galactic Arm. They had always viewed humanity with contempt, believing that a species without psychic abilities could never truly be dangerous. Over the next several hours, Kethril watched the crisis unfold on newsfeeds throughout the Academy. The Vornak had captured 3 human cargo ships and were holding 67 humans prisoner. They were demanding that humanity cede trading rights to several valuable star systems. "They think humans will negotiate," Professor Yevon said, joining Kethril in the crowded common room where students and faculty gathered to watch the updates. "They believe the threat to human lives will force concessions." "Will it work?" Kethril asked. The professor shook her head slowly. "They have made a terrible mistake. Humans do not respond to hostage situations the way other species do. Threatening the lives of humans does not make them cautious. It makes them angry." The diplomatic channels went silent. For 3 days, there was no communication from humanity at all. No demands, no threats, no negotiations. The Vornak grew increasingly nervous, but they held their position, convinced that their superior psychic abilities would give them the advantage in any conflict. On the 4th day, human ships appeared. Kethril stared at the tactical display, unable to believe what he was seeing. There were only 3 vessels, small military craft that seemed impossibly inadequate against the massive Vornak fleet. 3 ships, a Muldra student said, confusion evident in his crystalline voice. "They send only 3 ships against a fleet of 40. This is suicide?" But Kethril had studied humans for a year, and he knew better. "Watch," he said quietly. The battle began, and it was over in 11 minutes. The human ships moved with precision that seemed impossible, dodging psychic attacks that should have been unavoidable, striking with weapons that passed through Vornak shields as if they did not exist. They did not destroy the enemy vessels. They disabled them. Surgical strikes that left every ship powerless but intact. Ship after ship fell silent, their systems dead, their crews helpless. The Vornak commander tried to flee and was cut off by a single human vessel that seemed to appear from nowhere. Within minutes, the entire fleet was drifting, and the hostages were being recovered. The Academy erupted in chaos. Students and faculty rushed to the news feeds, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. How had 3 small ships defeated 40 larger vessels so completely and so quickly? A human admiral appeared on every screen in the galaxy, a gray-haired woman with cold eyes and a voice like steel. Her message was brief and terrifying. "We took our people back. We could have taken more. Remember that." And then the human ships withdrew, vanishing into faster-than-light travel as quickly as they had appeared. There was no pursuit, no further retaliation, no demands for punishment or reparations. Just that single message, burning in the memory of every being who had witnessed it. Kethril found Commander Vance in the observation lounge later that evening, standing alone and staring out at the stars. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the events of the day had cost her something. "Why?" he asked, joining her at the window. "Why did you not destroy them? You could have wiped out the entire Vornak fleet. You could have made an example that no one would ever forget." Elise was quiet for a long moment. "We could have," she agreed. "The Admiral wanted to. There were voices in our government calling for the complete destruction of the Vornak hegemony. After what they did, after they put our people in danger, there were many who wanted blood." She turned to face him, and Kethril saw something in her eyes that he had never noticed before. A deep weariness that seemed to stretch back through centuries. "But we did not," she continued, "because we know what we are capable of. We have seen it. We have done it. To ourselves. We have waged wars that killed hundreds of millions. We have committed atrocities that still haunt our collective memory. We know exactly how far we can fall." Her voice grew softer. We made a promise to ourselves a long time ago. Never again would we unleash our full capacity for destruction, unless there was absolutely no other choice. We would be better than our history. We would prove that we could be trusted. Catherall thought about everything he had learned over the past year. That is not weakness. No, Elise said, and a small smile crossed her tired face. That is the hardest kind of strength there is. Anyone can destroy. Anyone can kill when they are angry and afraid. But choosing not to, choosing restraint when you have all the power, that takes something special. She looked back at the stars. Every human carries this burden, she said. We all know what we are, what we come from, what we could become. And every day, we choose to be something better. Some days it is harder than others, but we keep choosing. Catherall stood beside her in silence, watching the distant lights of 1,000 star systems. The next morning, he returned to the database for the first time in months. He opened the human file and scrolled to the threat assessment, reading the familiar words: human soul system, classification, Omega Apex. But this time, he noticed something he had missed before, a secondary note at the bottom of the file that he had never read. It was a single line, added by the Galactic Council's Threat Assessment Board after the fall of the Krethver Dominion. Do not mistake restraint for inability. The humans remember what they are. Catherall closed the file and sat back in his chair. Somewhere on the station, he could hear Commander Vance laughing at something a nervous alien student had said, a warm and genuine and utterly human sound. He thought about the creatures called humans, the persistent predators from a death world, the beings who had invented both nuclear weapons and human rights, the species that carried the capacity for unlimited violence and chose, every single day, not to use it. The apex predator, he realized, was not the one that killed the most. It was the one that could destroy everything and chose not to. Humans were not the most dangerous species because they had the sharpest claws or the strongest armor. They were the most dangerous because they had conquered the monster inside themselves, and they could release it whenever they wanted, but they refused. And as long as the galaxy gave them no reason to change that choice, as long as they were treated as friends and partners rather than threats to be contained, they would continue to be the greatest allies any civilization could ask for. But if that ever changed, if someone ever made them feel truly threatened, truly cornered, truly alone against the universe, Catherall shuddered. He hoped he never lived to see that day. The stars continued to shine outside the viewport, peaceful and eternal, and somewhere among them, billions of humans woke up and made the same choice they made every morning. Today, they would be kind. Today, they would be merciful. Today, they would hold the monster inside. And the galaxy slept peacefully, protected by creatures who had once terrified themselves, and who had sworn to never let that happen again.